What up, everybody? This is the Fire This Time podcast. My name is Sonny Toure, and today we are asking the question, what would Malcolm X have to say about the genocide that Israel's carrying out on Palestine? So to investigate that, we have a number of things we'll be looking at about his travels in the area and more. So before I say more, let me go on and introduce my brothers, my co-hosts, Akita G and Slank. Say what up, y'all.
Peace.
What's up, everybody?
Yes, sir. And with that, we're going to have Akita welcome y'all, and we're going to get started. Let's get it.
Well, as normal, people, welcome back. Thank you for joining us again and gracing us with your ears and things of that such nature. What you always can do, what you should do, and what we need for you to do is definitely leave us a like, give us a share. You know, even if you want to subscribe, do that. If you don't, just stay listening. But always make sure you like and you share. And when you feel the need to, leave a comment, give us some ideas, give us something to go off of. You know what I'm saying? Give us some feedback on what we putting out. We would definitely love to hear that from you. And with that, I'm gonna pass it back to my man, Sonny Toure.
All right. So as we said at the top of the show, we want to know, what would Malcolm do? What would Malcolm have to say? How would, Malcolm lead us in terms of, our solidarity, our relationship as Afro-Americans, the term he would use, or, as new Africans, as Black folk here in the U.S., our relationship with, Palestinians and their struggle. So, to investigate that, I want to bring on my boy, to begin our look at that. I want to bring on my boy Slank. And Slank, I want to pass it to you with this question. Why do you think it is, so important to highlight Malcolm X's internationalist vision, overall, and even more specifically, his anti-Zionism? Why is that important to highlight in 2025, bro?
Definitely. Big reason I think it's important to highlight it is because we see this a lot with all type of different historical figures, especially Black revolutionaries, but their image a lot of times gets used and put on different, used and distorted for different causes that the person whose image it is wouldn't necessarily endorse. Lenin said, like, when a revolutionary dies, a lot of times they'll take his image, promote it, but emasculate the essence of the message, right? So, like, you see it with Martin Luther King, but definitely with Malcolm too. And I think a big part of his ideology that's kind of, not talked about as much sometimes is the international aspect. Both during his time with the Nation of Islam and after, he was very tuned in to what was going on in Africa and Asia and the non-white world, the revolutionary movements. And he saw the interconnection of the struggles domestically and the struggles overseas. He used to say things like, you can't get Mississippi figured out until you get the Congo figured out. He was very vocal about that.
Yeah, let me play this clip real quick and then you can tag right back in.
The problem of the Black people in America is inseparable from the problem of the Black people in America is inseparable from the problem of oppressed people all over the world. And until the leaders of Black America realize that our problem is inseparable from the entire international problem, we will be considered a minority, will be considered an underdog, and will be begging for the things that we should have had when we were born. The problem of the Black people.
So
go ahead, Slank.
No, a big point he just made right there is that idea of, like, being a minority. Malcolm X used to often point out that globally, Black people are the majority. Non-white people make up the majority of the earth, and if we link together with these other people that are oppressed, people that are coming up against colonialism and rising up, it can only strengthen our position to link with like-minded revolutionary causes and whatnot. And it wasn't about, like, it was still, he's still a Black nationalist wanting to create a Black organization for Black people, but at the same time, he's ready to link with the Vietnamese. He was a big admirer of Mao. he linked with the Palestinian cause, things like that, if they were on a common front or something.
Yeah, I think what we admire so much about Malcolm X, one, of course, his sincerity, but also in this internationalist context, he recognized that he wasn't content with just being a mouthpiece or a representative. You know what I'm saying? He wanted to represent, a new African or an Afro-American nation that had the capacity to, actually, assert its power, in the international arena, for its benefit and for the benefit of, the entire diaspora and continent, all oppressed people. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, I mean, just like you said, Aki, Slank, he had this internationalist focus while remaining a nationalist, and just like we discussed in part one, if y'all have not seen part one, so much of what we discussed in part one was Malcolm X, so focused on, empowering, the Black community through the organization of Afro-American Unity to develop the capacity, through, business expertise and culture, among other things, to, aid in, Pan-African struggle. So yeah, my bad. I pass it back to you, Slank.
No, but yeah, so like with the overall question of what would Malcolm do in today's context of the ongoing genocide in Palestine and Gaza, where the Israelis have, officially they'll say on TV it's 50,000 dead, 60,000 dead, but it's over 2 million displaced. The whole area destroyed, probably 900,000, if not more, deaths from all the diseases, bombs, everything. What would Malcolm do though is he would definitely be in support of the Palestinian people, and he wouldn't, shun the struggle over there as like an unimportant event that has nothing to do with us. He would probably, point out the connections that Zionist dollarism, which he used to write about, has in the U.S., and that's its connection to how they train the police in America, how the Zionists, pay off all the politicians in America, how, the influences in the music industry controlling Black film, Black movies, all that shit. So I think Malcolm X would definitely be taking a strong anti-Zionist stance, if not trying to link with organizations over in the area that are fighting against the Israelis, like Hamas, Hezbollah, things like that. Because during the 60s, when the Palestinians were, fighting the Israelis just as they are now, Malcolm was over there. He linked with the PLO in Cairo. There's photos of him over there. He met with one of the chief judges. Yeah, there he is, Malcolm X in Gaza, 1964, meeting with leaders of the PLO. He also met with the chief judge over in Gaza when he went over there. And because he was also real close to President Nasser in Egypt, so that was another link that he had between like the African world and the more in the Gaza and the Middle East and things like that. But he was writing articles in the Cairo Gazette in the 1964 about the Zionist control, Zionist dollarism, as he called it, and asking what was the justification for Palestine to be taken by the Israelis if there was no Messiah, because that was their whole religious thing, is linking it with the Bible and whatnot. And he even asked if Ralph Bunche, a Black UN diplomat type man, was their Messiah, because he had played a part in getting the Israelis the state and everything.
Mm-hmm. No, big facts. Aki, you got anything before we keep it moving?
Well, I definitely would say this. I agree with y'all's stances that, Malcolm maintained a wise position in his nationalism by not only taking a domestic, but also an international stance. Pretty much saying that I'm an African, but I'm an African or Afro-American, but I'm still a part of the greater African family. That's a stance that we all should have, when it comes down to recognizing who we are, and domestically, but also in relation to the world and those people around the world that have things in common. But what Malcolm also lets us know in this is that, it's not necessarily just about us as a race or ethnic group, a race on the planet or an ethnic group here in North America, that there's other peoples that are outside of us, that are in this fight for liberation and freedom and self-determination like us. So, going definitely back to the question we asked at the beginning, and Slank just presented, what would Malcolm do? Malcolm did exactly what Slank spoke of, that we would support the Palestinians in their fight for self-determination. We would not make it the center of our focus, but we would make it a part of our focus, because those are people across this planet that may not look like us or have the same historical background as us, but these people are fighting against the same oppressive forces as us. So I definitely agree with everything that's been said, on the domestic, on the international, and on the current theme of what would Malcolm do. I'll say peace.
Peace. Yeah, I want to dig a little bit more into this article. I think it is something to highlight that Malcolm X is this, international intellectual slash, journalist. You know what I'm saying? And Samosha, I do recommend. I think the author's name is Maria Sherwood, if I'm not mistaken, that published an edited volume of Malcolm X's journals while he was on his international travels. In the last 2 or 3 years of his life. That really highlights, what he was thinking and what his motives were. A really wonderful read. I recommend that. But yeah, I mean, just the fact that he was over there, writing articles, digging in, to things, in ways that, his contemporaries that are, typically seen as more intellectual, certainly, more scholarly, a lot of them, were not, at this stage of their understanding of Zionist logic, and its relationship to the, oppression across the world. Malcolm X is showing a very advanced understanding for 1964 that, we see people in 2025 not comprehending yet, right? So I'll read a little bit of this here. The Zionist armies that now occupy Palestine claim their ancient Jewish prophets predicted that in the, quote, last days of this world, their own God would raise them up a, quote, Messiah who would lead them to their promised land. And they would set up their own, quote, divine government in this newly gained land. This divine government would enable them to, quote, rule all other nations with a rod of iron. If the Israeli Zionists believe their present occupation of Arab Palestine is the fulfillment of predictions made by their Jewish prophets, then they also religiously believe that Israel must fulfill its divine mission to rule other nations with a rod of irons, which only means a different form of iron-like rule, more firmly entrenched even than that of the former European colonial powers. So think about what he's saying here, how the type of rule that Israel is able to put on the world will be more firmly entrenched even than that of former European colonial powers, which of course have, seen tremendous losses in their control of the world over the past century. I'll read this last paragraph of this first introduction, section, then I'll pass it off to Slank. These Israeli Zionists religiously believe their Jewish God has chosen them to replace the outdated European colonialism with a new form of colonialism, so well disguised that it will enable them to deceive the African masses into submitting willingly to their, quote, divine authority and guidance without the African masses being aware that they are still colonized. And Slank, I just got to pass it to you with this with this idea. When you think about the, I won't say whose control, but no, I'm just playing. When we think about the Jewish control or the Jewish degree of control in so many different, important industries, I'm saying, not to mention slavery, all up and through, when we think about Afro-American culture, in music and film and things like that, and the ability for, these cultural products to, take part in deceiving us. You know what I'm saying? And and they'll tell you straight up, yeah, we're gonna sell this music that lies about, drugs and guns and all this shit. And we don't care because we're making money from it. We gotta feed our families too. And they talking about billions, right? So I don't know. That shit just made me think about that. I'm gonna pass it to you though, Slank. What is this first first 3 paragraphs of Zionist logic? Where it put your mind at, bro?
No, I mean, I think he breaks down really well how they're tying religion to colonialism to try to shield their actions, which seems to be a common theme. If you question what Israel's doing, one of their defenses is you must be anti-Semitic for daring to question what, a Jewish nation would do who's been through the Holocaust, all that kind of shit. So he's just showing how that's going to like create kind of like a concealed version of this new European colonialism. Because he points out that it's just European Zionists. Later on, he goes on to does a really good job of talking about how Israel was strategically placed where it was placed. Part of the reason being so that the European countries, Britain, United States, France, etc., could divide the Africans and the Asians against each other, be kind of like a wedge, a strategic ally for Western colonialism in that region to sow division. And he says that one of the Israelis' new tools isn't just, straight up brute force colonialism, which they still employ, obviously, but it's also the use of Zionist dollarism or offering aid to these newly independent African countries, newly independent Asian countries, as a way to get into those countries and kind of control their direction and make sure that they're friendly toward the overall goals and aims of Zionism, that the leaders who are in power in those countries are on board with Zionism, and kind of steer these newly independent countries in the wrong direction. And you still see it today with Israeli agricultural experts, helping out African countries and things like that, offering aid to African countries to try to get them to be on the sidelines when they carry out a genocide, when they invade Syria or bomb Iran. So using that economic aid, and we see it with American foreign policy as well, with things like USAID, and even the State Department wrappers is an element of that, using the dollars and infiltration to, as a alternative to just straight up brute force. But yeah.
Big facts. And it's remarkable just how similar this writing is to, Fanon's at the time as well. When I think about Fanon, writing about how, the first act of warfare in terms of, the colonial assault on the colonized, the first act of war is a more cultural attack. And and so Fanon spoke about the the ability for colonialism to repress in more ways than just physically brute force, as you was referring to, Slank, and of course Malcolm as well. So yeah, it is remarkable just thinking about how similar their writing, some of their writing is at this time. Of course Malcolm X, and also Robert F. Williams, just to think about another person meet on their centennial celebration this year. Robert F. Williams was reading Fanon during the mid 60s as well, as he's making his anti-colonial turns. So
yeah.
Anyways, Slank, Akidi, y'all got anything else here?
I mean, I would just say that it's also tied to the domestic issues too, even his Zionist stance, because he has speeches speaking out against Jewish control of the Black community, where he's using some of the same, kind of the same themes that he's doing in the Zionist Logic article, when he's referring to how a lot of the businesses in Harlem, for instance, were controlled by Jewish merchants and stuff that were exploiting the Black working class in Harlem.
I mean, there's some historical roots in that too. The pre-Zionist or pre-Zionist or Zionist, if you want to call it. The same way they interject money or they interject themselves into various different crimes across the planet, but specifically when I'm thinking of just the slave trade in general. You know, the slave trade got a lot of its backing from that Jewish money. It wasn't until that Jewish money came into play that it really started to really kick up because the financing was behind it. And so even when we look back on the domestic side, we definitely can see that in the cultural context, going back to Fanon. In Fanon's work, he wrote more alluding to how they can do certain things concerning women, creating dissatisfaction with the women and the men in that country, which specifically he attacked the headdress of the women at that time, which was a cultural aspect of the people in that area. And so even when we look at us and we think about our culture, specifically the things we do in the music and entertainment industry, during segregationist times, they didn't really have an inroad to that. We were still able to keep certain levels of independence of it. But when you start talking about those Jewish shareholders and presidents and CEOs of these various different entertainment and distribution companies, they interjected that international money, that corporate money, into the music. With Motown, they did it with Def Jam and hip hop. They've done it over the generations. They probably even had a hand in some of the Juneteenth merchandise we see out here right now. So we see their hands in too many different things. And, to hear Malcolm, plus Fanon, but to hear Malcolm, point that out, even then it does point to a high level of thinking, but also a high level of vision. He was seeing something at that time that, and taking stances at that time that a lot of people wasn't really willing to make. So,
I think you're pointing out something real important when we think about that Fanon chapter. I believe it's entitled Algeria Unveiled. And he's talking about the veil, of course, that covered the faces, the bodies of these Muslim women that European colonizers would encounter. And Fanon wrote about the erotic fetishization that the colonial lens took on towards the women, and thus the feminine part of the those that they would colonize, those that they were in the early stages of colonizing. And to unveil them, the European wasn't content on just doing that with brute force. It had to be, it was other forms of coercion at play. And one thing that Fanon said in that article, and we reviewed it on the podcast before, and we should do it again, this time with slang. I think that would be great. Once we dig into this, next time we dig into this issue. But one thing Fanon said in that article was that the colonizer would attempt to convince the colonized woman that the man of their community was trying to demonetize them. Fanon used the term demonetize. And, think about that in terms of the capitalist world order that was maturing and is still maturing, in our lifetimes. You know what I'm saying? So let's take that to the domestic context just to complete the cipher, right? Malcolm X was part of that underworld, while he was, a so-called, criminal, in Harlem and other places. You know what I'm saying? So he saw up close the fetishization that white people had towards the black body. So there's a lot to say there. That Malcolm X was somebody who recognized it, and as a Nation of Islam minister, spoke out against it, right? But also Robert F. Williams. Let's not leave him out here. If you read any of, for instance, Negroes with guns. He speaks about there about early in his childhood, seeing white tricks, come into his community and try to pick up women. If it wasn't in there, it was in his biography by Timothy Tyson. Robert F. Williams defending, his community from, white tricks trying to, pick up the women in his community that were tricking, right? So this is something that the protection of women and this perceived, and of course I would say real emasculation, right? That is within colonialism, is and has been a big part of the story. So yeah, I'll pass it off there.
No, definitely. And yeah, Malcolm spoke about the same type of things, about how the white society maneuvered black women into things like prostitution, into poverty, things like that. So yeah, he literally has a speech on every topic you can think of. It seems like back in the 1960s.
And of course, we know in Palestine what they're enduring right now too is much of the same. Brutal and as explicit of violence as you can imagine. And that is at the same time running parallel to the fetishization of Arabic women by Jewish men. The most contradictory things you could imagine, they exist and thrive, right?
It's just one of those tactics that the colonial presence brings when it comes into a people with a certain type of strength that holds them together. It's like a poisonous tactic. It's like what the messenger Elijah Muhammad said, a skunk of the planet Earth. It filters up things. It's a snake, And so that's how I sort of look at colonialism. And that's what it does. It rots off at a society. So you saying now sort of high levels of prostitution pop up right there in the Palestine, even with the culture being the way it is. The actual conditions that's produced from that colonial war being waged over there produces certain levels of poverty and stress and things like that that's sort of bringing people into some of these lifestyles. So sometimes just the presence of the colonial master will breed an environment that will eat away at the culture. But that's what it's meant to do, to eat away at the culture, So, we've seen it in the Black community when we look at most of the issues that we have in our own communities. A lot of those issues stem from poverty and the conditions that's been created by the oppressor where we reside and call our domicile in our communities, in our environments. So, it's like Malcolm and all the other brothers, especially when you talk about people like Robert F. Williams, they were willing to expel that presence out the community, and that's something that I think Black people need to start looking at, maybe on different levels, but maybe on the same level. Peace.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And it goes beyond just this with Robert F. Williams. It's not just he did defend his community from this perceived attack on its women, on its vulnerable women, right, that he perceived. But also, let's not forget that just outright attacks occur too. How violent the South was back then, we can't imagine. What really turned things for Robert F. Williams, what made him eventually have to be forced out of the NAACP. There were two cases tried on the same day in Monroe, North Carolina, where his militant chapter of the NAACP was. Two separate Black women attacked by white men, right? One of them, I believe her name was Ruby Smith. She was attacked by a white man, dragged down the street in front of her son, right? Both of those white men let go. So, I mean, at all levels, you know what I'm saying? White society targeting women, and this being something that incited, you know what I'm saying, black nationalist militancy. You know, once they were let off, the women in the courtroom, the black women in the courtroom turn towards Robert F. Williams and they say, how could you let this happen to us? Why did they say that? Why did they say that to Robert F. Williams? They said that because before the trial, those families that those women were part of came to Robert F. Williams and said, we don't trust in the American legal system. We need to go over there, take these guns that we got and do it ourselves. And Robert F. Williams at that time said, no, we got to let the court system do what it's going to do, you know. And then when it turned out how it turned out, the community turned to him and said that, you know, and that's when he turned to the cameras that were there. And he said, we had to fight violence with violence, lynching with lynching. And, you know, the rest is history. And if you don't know that history, you know, I'm sure that we'll cover it on a future episode of the Fire This Time podcast. You know what I'm saying? But yeah, you know, I thought today's episode, it was a good look at, you know, Malcolm X's anti-Zionism, the importance of the internationalist outlook, and how, you know, all these things are really connected. You know, when we think about the colonial, you know, lens and how it views us and our bodies and our communities, you know, we got to take it serious. You know what I'm saying? And I hope this, you know, this week's discussion, this episode's discussion, you know, helped us do that collectively. You know what I'm saying? Aki and Slant, what y'all got, man, to close things out?
I'd say definitely, you know what I'm saying? Take the time to, you know, think about that wonderful question. What would Malcolm do? Especially when you're thinking of political and social and economic stances concerning the community and things of that such nature. That's if you have a black nationalist leaning. I don't think Malcolm would turn you and lead you anywhere astray. And just remember that, you know what I'm saying, yes, it's you against the world, but there is other people in this world, and that, you know, when we do work with people who have shown themselves to be, you know, to have integrity, you know, we can get some shit done, you know. Not everybody's story is the same, but not everybody's story is different. And with that, I'll say peace.
Yes, sir. No, I don't have nothing more to add to that. That pretty much sums it up.
Yes, sir. Hey, thank y'all for joining us for this episode. We got more in this Malcolm X series coming in the future. It probably won't be the next episode, but later this year, look out for more in this Malcolm X series. Next up for us is going to be our series on the Ford Foundation and the influence of this, you know, this shady NGO nonprofit / you know, state intelligence, you know, sphere of society, that dark, shady influence on Black social movements. We're planning a series on that should be getting started here very soon. You know what I'm saying? We might have a few random episodes, you know, in between that, but that's what's coming next for us. So look out for that, y'all. We're going to catch y'all next time. My name's Sonny, here with Slank and Aki the G. Peace.
Peace, y'all.